Signore e signori, buonasera, benvenuti a questa virtuale casa italiana zerilli-marimò. As you know, we are still not able to offer in-person events, but we are delighted to finish this academic year that was eventful, maybe in ways that we would have preferred not to be eventful, but definitely intense. And we close this academic year with a great event with two great friends of Casa Italiana. And the very topic that they're discussing this evening, that is translation, seen under different points of view, is the very essence of what Casa is, not because we do only translations, but because translating one culture into another and being able to mediate different cultures is at the essence of the work of translation. As you know, the occasion of this panel discussion between Jenny McPhee and Jhumpa Lahiri is the publication of Jhumpa Lahiri's last book, Translating Myself and Others. And you might have read the article in the New York Times, I think on Tuesday, and there is a sort of already un assaggio, a taste of the themes and the topics that Jhumpa assesses in her book. And what I was trying to tell my friend to explain why they must be with us and be present in this discussion is that basically everybody who is bilingual or at least knows another language faces at a certain point the issue of the presence of different languages, of different codes of communication in their head, in their hearts, and how you deal with them, with the words that you've always known and with the words that you learn because you're determined to learn a different linguistic code. As it is common in the webinars and in the virtual reality in which we have been dwelling for quite a while, we keep the presentations to a minimum. As I told you, both Jenny and Jhumpa are two very good friends of the Casa. I always say that Jhumpa is probably the best thing that happened to Italian literature, contemporary Italian literature in the last 20 years. And I'm not joking. The fact that a writer with her prestige, with her reputation, with her passion for writing and for literature, decided to embrace a language that was totally foreign to her and embraced it in a way that was not only to speak it, but to become a writer in that language, makes the case of Jhumpa with the Italian a case that I think will be studied way ahead of time and in the future, because it's a unique component, a unique coincidence of different factors. And I think the final result is that Italian literature has acquired a new writer without American literature losing a great writer that it already had. Jenny McPhee is also an author and a translator. So they both share this destiny and of being fiction writers and translator, of translating sometimes themselves, as you will hear, and sometimes other authors in another language. And both also have academic appointments. We are very lucky to have Jenny McPhee at New York University. Jenny, she's not officially in Italian. She's the director of a different program in which I would like to emphasize that she put the very job of translating at the center of the map, of the cultural map at NYU. Other professors taught translation before Jenny arrived, but I think with her and the program that she runs, really literary translation has acquired a new dignity and new importance within our university. And for that, we're very grateful to Jenny, not to mention that being also an Italianist and an Italophile, we have done a variety of different and many, many exciting programs. And I hope in the future we'll do more of those. And Jhumpa, who is a professor right now of creative writing at Princeton University, has just been announced that he's going to return to her alma mater, Columbia University, to teach creative writing. But of course, she will be affiliated with the variety of different other departments, including the Department of Italian Studies. And for that, I have to say that I'm a bit envious. But the fact is that both Jenny and Jhumpa are going to be in New York, not next year, but the year after. So it's going to be easier for us to access them and to bring them back to talk about language, to talk about literature, to talk about translation. And without further ado, I would like to ask them to appear and show their beautiful selves and to continue in this conversation. Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you so much, Jhumpa, for being such good friends of Casa Italiana zerilli-marimò. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefano. Hello, Jhumpa. It's always great to be back here at the Casa Italiana, which feels to me, even virtually, like a second home. So I'm thrilled to be here in conversation with Jhumpa Lahiri, who never ceases to amaze and surprise me. Two qualities I find essential to being an artist, but also are a great basis for friendship. So Jhumpa is always finding new ways to delight and be delightful, and she keeps me very much on my toes. It has been an ongoing source of pleasurable astonishment for me to discover all the many ways my and Jhumpa's interests intersect, including our love of Italian language and literature and our devotion to the art of translation. So her new book, Translating Myself and Others, is a tour de force, a collection of essays that intimately and elegantly describe her personal and intellectual journey as a writer into the world of translation and the profound impact that has made on her thinking and identity. She generously, sensitively, and with her signature rigor takes us with her on this journey by way of Ovid, Aristotle, Gramsci, Calvino, Samuel Beckett, Leonora Carrington, Elena Ferrante, and so many more. So I have a bunch of questions for Jhumpa, but we also want to hear from you. So please put your questions into the Q&A, and I'll do my best to include them in our conversation. Julian also tells me you can raise your hand, and he will try and manage you actually being able to voice your question verbally. So, Jhumpa, I do have many questions for you, but why Italian is not one of them. Even if it is the title of the first essay in this collection. This essay, you say, is a kind of coda or external epilogue to your earlier beautiful book, In Altre Parole, or In Other Words, translated by Anne Goldstein. And that tells the story of how you came to fall in love with Italian language, a love I think it's safe to say that all of us here share. But for the answer to that question, why Italian, I highly recommend that everybody here read In Other Words. And Julian's going to put links to the books in the chat or in somewhere. So anyway, my first question for you instead, Jhumpa, is another, but it's related. So in that first essay, Why Italian, you bring up another fascinating series of questions that have become, in my career as a writer, a translator, and a teacher of translation, increasingly present and important for me and my students. And here I'm going to quote from the essay. The questions are, who possesses a language and why? Is it a question of lineage, mastery, use, affect, attachment? What does it mean in the end to belong to a language? So in Translating Myself and Others, you deeply explore this fundamental idea of language and belonging. And I just was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your early encounters with this question of language and belonging as the child of immigrants and growing up in two languages.
Of course. Thank you, Jenny, so much for engaging me tonight in conversation. I am very happy to spend some time with you, and thank you to the Casa, and thank you, Stefano, for such warm and generous words of introduction. I too feel, even in Zoom, I feel so just so welcomed, and so thank you for that always. In whatever format. I appreciate it so much. So yeah, this question of belonging and language it's really they're the two questions, belonging and language. And if we think of language as the core of identity for so many, sort of the root of identity, what remains when we peel back the layers of identity. I certainly for me, as the child of immigrants, as someone who never had an exclusive relationship with any one language, the problem of not belonging was always rendered very concrete by the feeling of not belonging to either of the languages that were clearly a part of me. Bengali and English from a young age were clearly both, they were my two languages. And so those languages were who I was, but I didn't feel fully part of those languages. And I felt on the outside of each of those languages for different reasons. So I think that my sense of not being, not having a concrete identity, not having a defined identity, is very much, kind of stems from the linguistic question. And it's a question that I've been purposefully troubling over the years, and into my adult life. But I think that now the troubling of this linguistic question is in some sense the solution, right? It's the solution and not simply the dilemma that it felt, that I felt it was when I was.
It's so incredible. So, I mean, to me, this privileging of the mother tongue that as a translator, sort of going into it, early in my career, I would recommend to people, oh, yes, it's better if you translate into your mother tongue. And you and my students, too, who are many of them have similar situations to yours, that you're born into sort of two languages, have totally changed my view on this entirely. And so now I think how many ever languages and whatever you can do to translate in and out of all language is really so important. So, as you express in your book, language in all of its forms is kind of owned by everyone in all sorts of different ways. And is there something about choosing a language to learn for no apparent reason? I mean, it's just another language that you happen to fall in love with. Has that been liberating for you in terms of understanding not only that language, but your other languages? I mean, how much has that sort of taught you about the languages that you did, that were your first languages?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are many interesting contradictory elements regarding the question of freedom, in terms of moving into another language and moving into a language that I chose. In this case, I chose. No one chose it for me. No one selected it for me. There were no expectations. And I remember coming across a line in Pavez's diaries at one point when he equates choice with freedom. And he says that without choice, there is no freedom. And I thought this was very illuminating to me. I was reading this after I had begun my Italian experiment, and it spoke to me because it was a language I chose. Having said that, I do sometimes feel that I was called by Italian, that Italian chose me in some mysterious fashion, because whatever was happening, whatever has happened, is so powerful, has been so powerful and, totalizzante, right? It's just taken over everything practically in my life. And so I sometimes ask myself, I think I was in charge of choosing Italian, but who knows? Maybe there are other forces in life.
I totally relate to that, because in my case, I had taken French since third grade. So French was the language that I was proficient in. I went to graduate school in, and somehow in the end, it was Italian. And that was even before I met my husband, who is Italian. But somehow it did. It was like some force, and I don't know what it was, but it happened in a similar kind of way. There's also another aspect to translation that you point to again in the same essay when you say a language, a person, a country, everything is renewed only thanks to contact, closeness, and mixing with the other. So in teaching my translation, literary translation course, I find again and again that there's almost a political aspect to translation. Like all these people are learning another language brings you so much closer to other cultures. Another culture opens everything up to you. It's almost as if it is a form of cultural diplomacy, and all the people who do translation are little ambassadors for global ambassadors. And if you can't learn a language, but you could read in translation, right? And that's another form of that. So notoriously, in the US and the UK, only a tiny fraction of literature in translation is published compared to other countries. It's that famous 3% number. But as Stefano was saying earlier, you have done so much, along with Elena Ferrante, to reverse this trend and to put translation front and center as a form to be celebrated instead of, they used to hide it, and the biggest compliment about a translation would be, oh, it reads like it was written in English, and they hide the translator's name, and there's a real reversal going on in terms of how we see translation. And do you have that sense too, that English speaking readers are becoming less resistant and more enthusiastic about reading in translation?
I certainly hope so. I mean, it's so obvious that, of course, we're all, I assume we've all always been reading in translation and have been totally dependent on translators and good translators to give us a full sense of what literature is. Reading only in one's language is it's false, really, because even in any one given language, right, we know that writers are always being inspired by other literatures, and so often the richest literatures and the richest literary traditions and the most interesting authors are always hungry for writing in other languages, and whether that's to be very obviously incorporated into their own work, such as Dante, for example, or simply to sort of broaden one's literary horizons and to learn about sort of different world experiences and to cross those boundaries as readers. But so it's false to think that if one is reading in one language only, that one is actually only reading in that one language, because the author is often making, with leaps and bounds, absorbing other languages in any case, whether directly or in translation. And all of that is feeding the writer and feeding what the writer is going to produce. Right.
So true.
Yeah. So in any case, we are all reading in translation. We just aren't aware. We aren't aware of how central translation is. And what I have come to understand more and more, and really to believe, is that translation is the center of the literary solar system. It is the sun of the literary solar system. And it's not one of these sort of distant planets or, masses that are sort of vaguely swirling around. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the opposite, because everything is revolving around translation, and the propagation of literature across time and across boundaries, across languages, is only thanks to translation. And if we don't have translation, it falls, into these silos. And so absolutely, I think that translation is central to the literary enterprise, at the center of the literary enterprise. And so there has to be a sort of reversal of how we are thinking about translation across the board. But I think it has been an exciting time recently, and there is more attention, and there is more interest, and there is more conversation, and that's a wonderful thing. And certainly for me, one of the most galvanizing things was my research in putting together the Penguin Book of Italian short stories, because when I set out to put that book together, I didn't have anything in mind in terms of a framing for the collection. I just wanted to put authors I loved between covers and translated well. But what I came to realize, and what really astonished me, was the fact that the majority of writers in that collection were author translators, were in some cases people who became authors because they were translators first, were people who, or authors who were, so clearly nourished by the act of translation. And so putting that collection together sort of shifted the entire landscape for me. And I realized that I wanted to be like so many of the authors that I put into the anthology. And I wanted my own creativity to embrace translation alongside our quote unquote original output, right? Then we can have a long conversation about this O word, the original word, and what that means, and so on and so forth. But I think it's about redefining some of these terms, because
I completely agree with that. And what an amazing collection that was. And that must have been such an incredible experience to immerse yourself in Italian literature in that way. And we're getting a little off on that book because we're here for your new book, but doing that, I worked on that book with you, and you were just an incredible editor, which I found really interesting. It was almost like a co-translation thing, but because you really got so into the editing process, and I loved that with you. But those authors, did you have a criterion for why you chose those, and what did they teach you?
Well, I had sort of two groups. One was the group that had simply opened the first door for me into Italian. The authors I first were, the writers I was first able to really engage with, and the ones who sort of changed profoundly how I was reading. So authors like Moravia or Morante or I don't know, others in that initial category, Pavese. These were the authors I sort of cut my teeth on, in Italian, and the ones I was there with the dictionaries and looking up every word and trying to understand the beauty of their language. And then as I, after moving to Rome and everything, the horizon just opened up, and I started to meet more writers and have conversations with them, and to think about, I became aware of so many other writers, all from the same, 20th century. So there was this, sort of chronological limitation. But so these were authors I began discovering, authors I'd never heard of, living my pre-Italian life. And these authors became revelations for me, one after the other. So an author like Manganelli, an author like Delfini, an author like Cespedes. I had never heard of these authors, and I encountered them, and I thought, oh my God, I'm so lucky that I put all of this effort into learning Italian, because now I can read these authors. And so the anthology was a bit, un po'. It was a bit like I wanted to honor the first authors who had shown me the way. And then I wanted to also emphasize, in particular, women and other authors who had been sort of just kind of moved to the side and sort of a bit
forgotten, actually.
Forgotten,
I mean, a lot of those authors, Amabanti, that you introduced me to through that anthology, a lot of Italians can't remember either, so you were bringing it back to Italians as well as to the rest of the English speaking world. So,
well, one of the things that was satisfying to me when the anthology did come out was that even with the Italian readership, people would always say there was at least one author they had never heard of. Or had never stopped to think about. So that was, and then that's me, the outsider. That's me, the outsider, shaping something that perhaps someone more familiar with the terrain would have thought differently.
Or just sort of unconsciously missed or not, thought of because they're not an outsider. So I'm going to just take a little step back because Clara Elizabeth has a question. And so she says, how has your sense of belonging changed during the process of moving between languages? I personally grew up with two languages and often feel alienated from one or the other, or even both at the same time. This in-between space, which actually I think is the space of translation, that's me, is incredibly difficult to live inside at times. So she's just wondering how we live there in those in-between spaces.
I don't know anything other than an in-between space. I've never experienced life in any other form. I've always felt in between, slightly on the outside of, slightly or largely on the outside of any given situation in my life. That there has never been a situation. Well, I won't say never. I mean, there are certain experiences in which I do feel, that I'm fully immersed. I'm fully immersed with the people I love, with my friends, with my family, with my work, but I think that because I then go on to discover Italian and Rome and Italy as a place to also be and to feel a sense of belonging, even though there is no documentation. There is no Italian name to correspond. There is no, there are no blood ties. These things do not exist. And yet I do feel the deepest sense of belonging I have ever felt to a place in Rome. And that belonging is also true. It's more here, right? And it doesn't correspond to a document, but it's just as strong or perhaps stronger. And we know from even from ancient literature that people move about and grow to love places and to feel comfortable in them. So right now I'm translating Ovid's Metamorphoses with my colleague Elena Baraz at Princeton, and we just finished up book 5, and there's the story of Arethusa, who is talking and explaining to Demeter, who's very angered because her daughter has been abducted and taken away by Hades, etc. And she's saying, I'm an outsider to this place, to Sicily, but this is my home now, and I love it, and this is my place, Now but that sense of the use of that possessive my is where it gets tricky, because, well, is it or isn't it? Maybe in the head and the heart it is, but then everyone around you will be saying, you actually don't belong here. This is not your place. You come from some other place. Or they keep asking you, what is the place that you come from? Because you clearly don't come from this place. So that's been my entire life. I have never, ever resided or spent any time anywhere in the world where someone has not asked me, where are you from? Where are you really coming from? So I think that my solution, or my coping mechanism, is to really sort of rework the meaning of the word belonging, and my understanding of the word belonging, and to create a definition for myself that gives me a personal sense of belonging, because I think belonging is something we crave. And at the same time, certainly many writers, artists, and others also are suspicious of belonging and seek the margins. And that is where so much is created, right? And so many people have talked about the fertility of the margins, whether we're talking about creative fertility, intellectual fertility. Really, it's not at the center, and it's not in that sort of place, the hearth, as it were, and yet we cannot discount the hearth, right? We do crave, I think, as creatures, we crave a sense of a home, of a place, of a space that is comforting, that is sheltering, that is pleasing, that will not refuse us. I think that's also true. I imagine even for nomadic populations, in the moment in which they settle, whether it's for a night or a week or a month, they make home there. They make a home, right? And they create environments that are sustaining and nourishing and beautiful.
Yeah, that's it. It's so fascinating, and it goes back to the quote you said earlier about the Pavese quote about choice and freedom, and how that creates a different sense of belonging. You create your sense of belonging. So here's a fabulous question that I know you're going to love, from Alessandro Jamei, who because I read that fabulous interview with you, and you addressed this. But okay, he says, "Ciao, thank you for this delightful conversation. The cover of Translating Myself and Others looks like a modern, elegant, and genderless visual incarnation of Janus, a Roman deity, arguably the god of translation, definitely the patron of passages, doubleness, and doors. That is never mentioned in the book. Jhumpa, will you ever write an essay about Janus, considering that you are currently immersing yourself in so much in the Roman classics?"
Absolutely. And infatti, it was, so just full disclosure, Alessandro is my dear friend, and in many ways my mentor to me in my Italian journey and in my life journey at this point. And he has been instrumental in so many of the books that we've been talking about. Really every book since In Altre Parole, which I wrote before meeting Alessandro. But he and I refer to this book as Giano. That's what we call it. We've been calling it Giano for years. I mean, I in the subject heading of, anything to do with the book, we call it Giano. And I think what happened was it was in the tail end of the process of putting the book together. So this was just about a year ago. I was asked to participate on a panel for Princeton for plenary session that my colleague and friend Sandy Berman had invited me to speak at, and I wanted to I just wanted to keep thinking about translation, and I so the remarks I made were centered around Janus, the figure of Janus, and sort of looking at different interpretations, different visual interpretations, the iconography of Janus. And that's why the cover, the jacket, was, coming from me, because I already had it in my mind that the book was all about Janus, because the book was about translation, because I had already sort of formulated some of these sort of, preliminary thoughts for this session. And after that, the book was nicknamed Janus. And it occurred to me just the other day, I was looking at the index. This is my first book with an index, which was so thrilling. And I was looking in the index saying to myself, well, but surely Janus is in the index, and it wasn't. And I thought, how could that be? How could this whole book, which is about translation, and has a Janus on the jacket, and I refer to that in my acknowledgments. I thank the designer for clothing the book with a female Janus. I call it a female Janus, which is more rare than a male Janus. But I never mentioned the figure. So clearly there's a lacuna in the book that will have to be addressed at some point. And I think that my work with Ovid is already, I actually took, for my next book that's coming out in Italian, Racconti Romani, which is a book of short stories written in Italian and ostensibly set in Rome. And this is my homage to Moravia, of course. I take the epigraph from Ovid, and in fact, I take an epigraph from the lines in the Metamorphoses in which Janus is invoked. So Alessandro knows the answer to this question.
I sense there's an anteprima here that we're going to be hearing more about Janus.
Yeah. But I thank you, Alessandro, for bringing Janus into the conversation, because Janus is really the center now for me. I mean, I feel like it's my self-portrait, and it's interesting. It has been for many years. I've been aware of the way my initials are kind of a J and an L, right? And when I have to initial something, I will initial them in this sort of Janus-like configuration, like, how could I do it? JL, like this, which is a, sort of just, so even in my stamp, my signature, there's this Janus-like energy.
That's great. So we have some more questions, and this one is from Isabella Calisi Wagner. And she says, as a trilingual immigrant, do you lean on one particular language or another at certain times of your daily experience? I ask this because this has been my experience. And my experience of you, Jhumpa, is that, recently, Italian is where you're really leaning. A lot of that's where you're thinking in the language that you're in a lot of time lately. But anyway, her question is an interesting one. Does one take over or dominate? Or
I think it's all about, the more time I spend inside of Ovid's poem, the more I realize life is a flusso, right? It's water, and it's flowing, and it's moving, and sometimes it's sluggish, and sometimes it's speeding up, and sometimes it's crashing down. Sometimes it's very still and very transparent. And I think language moves through us this way, right? And if we have different languages, if we have 2, 3, 5, they are in different proportions in different times, in different moments. Obviously, when I'm living my life in Rome, Italian begins to dominate my day-to-day life. When I'm not living in Italy, it recedes somewhat.
But you do make a big effort to make sure it stays close to you. I noticed that. I think that's such a great thing.
I do. I did I did. I was so afraid. I was terrified to move back to the United States, and the main, source of terror was the distance from the language. I was very, very scared that the language would evaporate and leave me sort of dry and I was so desperate to prevent that. But now, and so I went out of my way to sort of create, make sure that the language was always cultivated. And now I still do, but I feel that now after 7 years of cultivation, or after many years of cultivation, there is a harvest, and, beautifully Italian is now a part of my life wherever I am in the world. And I trust that. And it's a remarkable thing to recognize, because it was totally absent essentially totally absent until about 12 years ago.
Right.
And really began to emerge 10 years ago. And if anything, it's gotten kind of stronger in the past 7 years that I haven't been living consistently in Rome. Though in those 7 years, I did go back 1 year to live back in Rome for my sabbatical year. But I think that to go back to the question, I mean, I think there's no easy way for us to say, well, it's not a pie where we say 20%, 40%, we can't do that, because it's not fixed, because language is life, and language is situation, and language is emotion. And those things aren't fixed states. They're not steady states.
No, but it is, it's a tool, it's a friend, it's a choice. So there is a lot, I mean, your conscious effort to stay with this language is really, an interesting thing. We assume about language that you either have it or you don't, or it's the immersion that's going to do it. But there's a lot about language that is very conscious and purposeful and deliberate. And I really appreciate you and how you have had that relationship with language. So here's another question from Priya. Do you think you express yourself differently in each language?
I do. And I think I'm a different kind. I think I'm a different, I have a different soul, if you will, a sort of different anima, certainly a different stato d'animo in each language, like my mindset sort of changes. And I noticed this just the other day. I was sitting at Princeton and having a conversation with a wonderful translator, by the way, Jeremy Tang, and we were talking.
Fabulous.
And we were talking in English. We had having nice conversation. And then I saw my colleague Simone Marchesi walk by, and I just looked up and I said, "Oh, ciao, Simone," and I felt my whole body change, and my voice changed, and I was very conscious of it, because it was just this 2 words, ciao Simone. And then I went back to the conversation with Jeremy, and I realized that the language, the tonality was different, my body language was different, and it struck me because it was such a brief flash of Italian. So I do feel different, but I also feel that I'm re-becoming the same person in some sense in Italian. How can I explain this? I mean, I think because I become a writer in Italian, because I learned how to write in Italian, that meant I had to unmake myself as a writer and become a writer all over again. And that is a very that's a sort of essential remaking of who I am in another language, and I think that's why it's settled so deep, and because I'm also constantly having conversations with myself in Italian, because now for 10 years I've been writing my diary in Italian, and And so that's a whole form of consciousness, right? In that diaristic mode, which is totally private and for me and has never been shared with anybody, but just pages that have accumulated over the years of my own conversation with myself, which I did in English as well, to understand who I was in the English language, because I didn't know who I was. I don't think anyone knows. We don't know who we are. We come to know who we are, I think, or at least I did. It took me a while to come to know who I was. And I'm still learning who I am. But certainly sort of the big raw questions of who I was were answered via writing, right? And whether that was the writing I was doing in the English language and an earlier part of my life, or in Italian in a more accelerated, concentrated period of my life in which I was more, quote unquote, adult, because I was, 45 years old, but I was also returning to a state of childhood and relearning sort of basic communication skills, which I had, sort of learned, many decades before.
That is so fascinating, and that question of who we are in different languages is just so interesting. One thing that happens to me is that when my husband and I fight, we will be speaking in English, and at a certain point, I'll just start speaking in Italian. And I don't know why. And is that because I really want him to understand, or is it because I feel it myself a little more performative in Italian, but a little softer? So, who knows, but things like that just happen. And I find it really just fascinating. And Daniela MacArthur says she's an Italian teacher living and teaching in the US after 30 years, and Italian is in her heart and English only in her head. She says, what do I think? And what do you think? I think, yeah.
I think again, with it moves around. I can't locate one somewhere as opposed to the other place. I think, Bengali also has a role, right, in my linguistic identity, and there's certainly Bengali in my heart as well. And when my son was born, I could only speak to him in Bengali. I just could not speak to him in English. And I did not speak to him in English for many years. I couldn't, and I didn't until sort of, his school teachers sort of asked us, my husband and I, to streamline his linguistic casserole and speak to him in English, which I still sort of regret, actually.
I know they do that, and that's not a good idea, actually.
No, I thought it was awful.
I know. We had that happen to us too with our children.
Yeah, when I think back, I wish I had been more disciplined and more confident in myself as a mother, as a parent, to insist. But in any case, so. And why was that? Because that was a language in which I had been mothered and loved. And so how could I do that in English to somebody? Now my son is 20 years old, and I have an intimate relationship with him in English. And that is our dominant language, though we mix it up a lot. And, if we're chatting on WhatsApp, he knows that I'm going to pick the shortest word. So if that's the Italian word, it's always domani. It's never tomorrow. It's always domani because it's faster. And he's fluent in Italian, and as is my husband, my daughter. So we mix up the two languages as we like. But I will say this, in terms of the head and the heart, English for a long time was more of the sort of more intellectual language, because it was a language of my learning, and it wasn't the language of the relationships that were, that I trusted most, and that happened over time. And now I feel that I do have relationships in English that are, incredibly, sort of important, needless to say, and crucial for me. And I also became a writer in English, right? I mean, to become a writer in a language, it's hard to be a writer in a language, become a writer in language without really embracing it. I mean, I know that, Agota Christoph talked about French being the always the enemy language, even though she produced work in it. And she produced work in French so that she could be read. But she had a sort of, there was this hostile energy between her and the language. This is what she describes. In my case, that's a very different situation. But in my case, whether I was writing in English, when I was writing in English, when I was learning to write in English, I worshipped, James Joyce. I worshipped the great writers who were teaching me how to make an English sentence beautiful and meaningful. And when I began to write in Italian, it was that same devotion that I was now paying to the Italian writers who are teaching me how to choose the words and create rhythm and create beauty and create meaning. So in that sense, a love for English was also very, very necessary for my growth and formation as a writer.
Oh, and if anything, Italian has given me a greater love of English, just because, the othering thing. So studying Italian then makes me look back at English and appreciate what English can do that Italian can't, or vice versa. And it just gives you this whole fabulous new perspective on language. So Kenneth Davis has a question sort of about original, which is a little bit a question I had too. I mean, in an interview that I read with you recently, you described translation as a game, which I love, as a game which you have to figure out how to play, and that each book presents its new rules and challenges, demanding it to be played differently. So that brought me back to this idea of, for years, there was always this idea that there was some kind of definitive translation, that, you take a book and there's going to be, who has done the definitive translation of, Don Quixote or Dante or so on, that there's some sort of right way to translate a book. So how is your thinking around this evolved around this question?
Well, I don't agree with it at all. I mean, we know there is no definitive translation. And what I like about translation is that it's even the greatest translations are in conversation with other translations, other great translations, other alternative translations. And there is conversation. Translation begets conversation, textual conversation. I think this is fabulous. And this is, now we open up the whole ecosystem of literature, and we have the cosiddetto, the quote unquote original, and then we have the translations, we have the interpretations, i.e. translations, and then we have translations that are going to be produced either in, alongside one another or in different time periods. And that's so beautiful. I mean, it's so beautiful. I mean, I'm just looking at my shelf of Dante translations, right? And it's so beautiful to think about sort of what Dorothy Sayers was doing when she was translating versus what Merwin was doing versus, what Singleton was doing versus Mandelbaum. So, and these are all translators working in in their times, right? In their moments. And they are each in conversation with Dante's time. And then if you take them all in together and think about them, there's such an interesting conversation that is just inherently emerging from how time is understood. Because, I mean, the translator, like Janus, well, the translator who is Janus, is looking forward and back. So if we just look at the temporal question, the translator is, needs to understand and respect and be in tune with the time of the original, the time of the work. Let's just call it the work was written, and then in tune with her own time, because we translate in order to reach other readers and writers in our time, right? That is the ostensible goal, to try to open up the book, open up awareness, greater appreciation for the work, whether that's a contemporary work or a work written, several centuries ago.
So I wanted to just go back to language and belonging and transformation. And, it's said that it's often said that things are lost in translation, and that there's some inherent betrayal, the famous phrase in Italian, traditore, which is translator, traitor. But translating myself and others, in which Ovid's presence is really felt throughout, shows how translation is actually more of a transformation, an act of becoming that revels in the ambiguous and the unstable. So in your really very moving afterword to your book, you write about the death of your mother and your next project, which you've sort of mentioned here. But and you have a new book of stories coming out in Italian. Plus, I think you're working on poetry in Italian. So could you tell the audience what they have to look forward to?
Sure. Well, the next book to be published is Racconti Romani, which will come out in Italian in September of this year. So that book is rapidly being sort of.
And we didn't get to self-translation, which I really wanted to talk to you about, but we'll do that another time. But
I'll mention.
Will you translate this one?
Yeah, I can. Okay. We can fold it into this question.
Okay, good.
This final answer, I suppose. And so that book, I wrote the stories in Italian, and over the years, I did translate a couple of the stories into English myself. One came out many years ago now in the New Yorker, called "The Boundary" in Italian.
Yeah, I remember
English,
that.
Sorry. And I translated a couple of others sort of along the way. And then the idea for the book in English started to, so as I was finishing the book in Italian, my American publishers were already also sort of saying, well, what are you doing now? And I said, I've got this book of stories. And I didn't know how to approach the question of who would translate it. Because I've tried, with each book, I've done a little bit of something always slightly different. So, in other words, In Altre Parole was translated by Anne. And then Dove mi trovo, I translated by myself, even though I had Frederica Randall's, first sort of sample to get me going. And that was also I was very grateful to her for doing that. And then with this book, I wasn't sure how to go about it. And I was in conversation with Knopf, and I met a wonderful translator named Todd Portnowitz, who is helping me. And he translated a couple of the stories as well. He's now translated 3 of the stories. There are 9 stories. So he's translated 3 of the stories. But what happened as I was finishing up the Italian version, and especially when I was sort of working on some of the later stories, I had an instinctive desire to very intensely translate into English those stories in Italian that I felt that were not quite fully done. And I knew they needed just a little bit something, one other layer of something. And I could only get to that by translating them into English. And once I translated them into English, all the imperfections emerged and all the little sort of problems and that would have, given me endless frustration had they come to light after the book had gone to press. And that would have happened the same thing with Dove mi trovo. So now translation for me with this project, with Racconti Romani, translation has become not only the most sort of efficacious and illuminating form of reading, but of editing.
So interesting.
Now I find myself in this really, really interesting situation of recognizing that and reckoning with what that is going to mean in the future.
It's kind of back translating. And then are you bringing what you have found out in English back to the Italian?
Look, the stories were done. So it's not the conception work. It's not
it's the editing, the tweaking.
It's the tweaking, the fine tuning that I'm doing in Italian. And now English is subentrato, right?
Yeah.
And helping me to get the Italian, because my goal is still to get the Italian to be as good as it can be. But now English has arrived as a sort of handmaiden. So, and this is new. This is brand new. This is something this just happened like a month ago.
That's amazing. It's so interesting.
So that's
it sounds a little Nabokov, I think he had that experience as well.
Well, and again, to go back to the idea of the game, it is a game and the rules are different each time. Each time with each project, it's been in a completely different set of components and translation questions and translator questions. And now, so Racconti Romani will come out in Italian, and the following year it will come out in English. And then finally, the last thing I have, I do have my poetry book, which I wrote in Italian, which I think will also come out in English at some point. I think I will translate at least the poetry in that book. It's a sort of hybrid text of poetry and prose. And then there's Ovid.
The Ovid. Tell everybody about the Ovid. I'm so excited for this.
So Ovid is, it's a new translation of a poem that's been, translated many times and in so many languages, including English and Italian. But I am translating it now from Latin into English with my colleague, Elena Baraz, who is a classicist at Princeton. And I think that what is so exciting for me, apart from just the absolute sheer ecstasy of the experience of being able to read this poem in Latin with someone who can guide me into the minutiae of Ovid's Latin, which I, with my, humble Latin training, am not capable of going deep down into the Latin the way she can, right? So it's only by reading it with her that I can even begin to glimpse the majesty of the poetry of Ovid, right?
You're doing collaborative translation, which is yet another whole subject,
which is a whole other thing. But the most amazing thing, I think, for me in terms of translating Ovid from Latin to English is that, I read Ovid as a college student with a brain that knew no Italian. And now I'm translating Ovid in this moment with my Italian, right? So I have right here, conveniently, I have my Latin dictionary, but it's my Italian Latin dictionary. And so what is fascinating to me about this project is that it's not that I'm leaving Italian aside for the time being to go to Ovid, because of course, how can I read Italian? How can I read Latin now without Italian? I'm reading Latin now as an Italian. reader.
Yeah.
Right? Not as an English reader. It's as an Italian reader, and it's the Italian that's dominating, very much dominating how I'm reading the Latin and even the rhythm of the poems. Even, when I'm reading it in meter, it's much more in conversation with Italian poetry, right? So that's been so that's the most recent project, and I think will be the most metamorphic experience of my life. It already has been, but it's an immense undertaking, but
you actually even get a certain glow when you talk about it. You're so ecstatic.
I am ecstatic. I'm ecstatic to be working on this project.
I mean, to get so intimate with that text must be just amazing, because it's sort of has the whole history of literature and everything in it.
Everything.
Right?
It's life. Everything's in that poem. And absolutely everything is in that poem. So.
It's so true. And it's just going to be so amazing that you're going to bring that to us across all of these languages and literatures. And it's fantastic. So, Jhumpa, it's always just an incredible pleasure. And I think we'll have many more conversations at the Casa.
Yes,
I'm sorry about the questions we didn't get to, but time is running out. And I'm just so happy that you all were here and that this beautiful book you've given us, Jhumpa.
Thank you so much. Grazie a tutte e tutti, and arrivederci.
A presto.
A presto.